All right. Hi, can I have everybody's attention, please? Thank you so much for coming to the wonderful Oswald Village Library today on this great day. We're very happy here. And I was going to do the introduction, but I know how much I think of my brother and always take the opportunity to introduce him. So I thought I would let Wendy introduce her brother, who we're so happy to have here with us today. And also Ray from Titcom's Books. We'll be selling the books here. So Wendy, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, so first I just want to thank Cindy and the Osterville Library, who have been amazing hosts for my brother as a speaker. This is actually his third time speaking, but only I think one person has been here, well, two people have been here multiple times. I'm really proud to introduce my baby younger brother, who's smaller and more handsome than I am and a better writer than I am. He proposed this book about 4 or 5 years ago called Parliamentary America. He wanted to have some kind of a way for lay people like me to understand how to improve our country and our current situation. So he wrote this and I did a lot of proofreading and we had to make sure that it was easy for common people to read, not lawyers. And I'm really proud that he has worked on this and his vision is to save our democracy or give us a path forward, because what's happening now are bandages on one side or bandages on the other side, and it's not working clearly. So I will turn it over to Max.
Thank you. So thank you, Wendy, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, Cindy, for organizing this, and Amy, who's not here, who helped organize this behind the scenes. Yeah, it's my third time speaking at this library. I've given quite a number of talks around the country, live and virtually, about this project, my book titled Parliamentary America. Whoops. See why that didn't advance. Try this. All right, I may need a little bit of technical help just to advance the slide. I'm not sure what happened there. Maybe not on the slideshow format. Anyway, what did I do wrong? Yeah, it may just not be format. May not be to the slideshow yet. That's all right. Oh, there we go. There we went. And now you're giving a sneak preview of coming attractions. That's okay. Let's get to the second one. That's okay. There we go. Yay! All right. Yeah. So I'll be talking about this book, which came out almost exactly 2 years ago. It's hard to believe. It came out on March 5th, 2024, and here we are, March 16th, 2026. It's kind of amazing for me to think about. So when I began this project, now going back 6-ish years, I realized that our country was in a state of crisis. And I had thought it was in a state of crisis long before then. I would sort of put the origins of the crisis moment roughly at the mid-teens, not my mid-teens, although I do remember them, but the country's mid-teens of this century. And my position is that although it's easy to ascribe the dangers that we are daily witnessing about our democracy on a single leader or a single party or a single institution, that it's also mistaken. That what we really need to understand is that some of the foundational premises of our constitutional system are profoundly problematic in ways that invite an exploitative leader to come in, take advantage of, and put us in the dangerous circumstances in which we find ourselves. There's no single leader that has caused this crisis. There's no single election that is capable of bringing us out of this crisis. To come out of the crisis that we face, we have to first understand its root cause, and we have to devise an appropriate remedy. And what set me on the mission of this book was that I looked at all of the available discussions in the public media, in the academic literature, and lots of people were beginning to recognize the crisis, were beginning to articulate proposals to extricate us from the crisis. And because of my rather unusual academic background that combines constitutional law with tools of economic analysis, I was able to see that the vast majority of proposals on offer simply would not work if they were adopted, and for very practical political reasons also could not be adopted. I would not have undertaken to write a book simply to tell people that they're wrong, not that I'm above telling people that they're wrong, but rather, it only was worth it to me when I actually began to focus on this so intensely that I could see a way out. And once I realized that I could see a way out, I realized the need to write a book, not for academics. I did not write this book for academics, but for ordinary readers, people like you, so that you would understand how we got to the crisis point that we are in, and also have a sense about how to understand it, how to explain it to others, and how to see a pathway forward. The markers of the crisis that I discussed the first and second time that I came here to the Osterville Village Library cut across traditional ideological lines. Here's a few. One, a widening distance separating our two major parties into teams that are so committed not only to their vision, but to denigrating the other side, that they're no longer ever willing to acknowledge that the other side might be looking at matters from a good faith perspective and simply disagreeing. It must be the case that those on the other side are either completely uninformed or are evil. The second is a constant desire for more choices in our political processes, coupled with a seeming inability to bring third parties into our politics. And third, a growing distrust in the ability either of Congress or of the Supreme Court to operate as meaningful checks against the ever-expanding powers of the President of the United States. More recent indicators that our system is failing include intensifying gerrymandering battles among the states and within the states, and I'll talk a little more about that later, increasing fragmentation, not only affecting the direction of the GOP, the Republican Party, but even staunchly within the Democratic Party, with a level of infighting that is remarkable in creating a kind of circular firing squad that renders it largely incapable of being a meaningful response to the dangers that are being posed by the other side. Expanding reliance on aggressive executive action at nearly every conceivable level, whether we're talking about the staffing of the courts, we're talking about the denigration of the independence of independent agencies, the denigration of the professionality of the civil service, the enforcement of immigration policy in ways that are really reprehensible, involving ICE, involving alligator Alcatraz, and also obviously what's happening on the international stage. See, for example, what's going on in Venezuela. See, for example, what's going on in Iran and elsewhere. And a general perceived inability of our institutions directly to confront fairly existential problems that are facing us, as, for example, climate change, the healthcare crisis, and national fiscal sustainability. And when you look at this kind of collection or aggregation of problems, it's quite clear that most people think something's profoundly wrong, even if they don't know precisely why or what to do. So, this might be the most controversial thing that I'm about to say. Although I believe our system is in crisis, and I genuinely do, I still think it can be fixed. That's the most controversial posit that you will hear from me, that I still think it is possible to come out of this mess as a better, thriving democracy. But to achieve that demands revisiting our basic assumptions that many hold about our civics, our Constitution, and our democracy. I'm going to make a proposal. It's not easy. The thing I'm going to propose is not easy. It requires us to revisit some fundamental premises about our system and to reckon with the need to undertake transformative change and to actually be willing to have conversations about amending our Constitution rather than more superficial reforms. Skeptics are going to tell me this is impossible. And I suspect some of you will fall into the category of skeptics. That's okay. I've converted some skeptics across the country when speaking to red audiences, blue audiences, purple audiences, older audiences, younger audiences, red and blue audiences across the country. I'm fine with skeptics. The only thing I ask for is have an open mind as I go through the talk. And if you want to be a skeptic during the Q&A, great, have at it. I love engaged conversation. All right, but in fact, it just turns out to be the case that the most seriously discussed reform proposals, ones that superficially appear less ambitious, just turn out to be less plausible. And more importantly, the most commonly discussed remedies are incapable of solving the crisis, even if they were enacted. But as I said, they also could not be enacted. So I'm going to begin with this concept that I refer to as the third party dilemma. I think I'll just turn off that slide and leave it blank for a moment. The third party dilemma. And I'll just tell you that the original proposed title for my book was The Third Party Dilemma. I was told, nah, not Kenji. So I didn't call it that, but it became the title of one of the chapters of my book. So what is the third party dilemma? In our system of government, we have single individuals representing individual House districts, states as a whole, and of course, the presidency, the entire nation. And when you have single elections, in single district elections based on geography with one person being elected, for reasons I will later explain, you end up inviting a two-party system. The framers never envisioned this. In fact, it's contrary to the game that the framers thought that they had created in our constitutional scheme. In the information age, which roughly corresponds to the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s, the two major parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, have grown so far apart that whichever team you're on, you think the other side is evil and its members are fundamentally misinformed, lacking basic intelligence. And our system is winner take all at every conceivable level. And so as a result, our system, two-party presidentialism, makes it impossible for either party to relinquish any part of its support, its base, for fear that if you gave up any constituency, you risk throwing power to the opposite team or the opposite party, and that means that you are giving up access to channels of power without which you can't actually effectuate any of your policy objectives. The realized danger in the system that we have, two-party presidentialism, is somebody holding autocratic goals for whom the inconvenience of democracy, of doing things the way the Constitution is designed to work, is simply too much to bear. And as a consequence, this person becomes willing to eradicate long-standing democratic norms that until the information age provided the foundation for accommodations that allowed our system largely to function. Now, I want to be clear. We have third parties. You all have voted. You've gone into the voting booth. You've seen the major parties, and you've seen that list of other parties, the people no one's ever heard of, and the parties that no one really is aware of, except very active people in the community who are dedicated to a cause, despite not understanding how supporting that third party will actually harm rather than help them. The problem in our system is that when you support a third party, you ultimately throw support to the opposite extreme by voting for what is referred to as a spoiler, or alternatively, by rendering the outcome a roll of the dice, what I call a randomizer. And the problem is, as a result, that we don't have space in our system for a third party. Since I gave the last talk, I can now say this. There have been three attempts, to create a viable third party in American politics. And I find this fascinating. Andrew Yang, left. Robert Kennedy, Jr., we can call him, what can we call him? We call him sort of, kind of, once called himself a moderate, right? We can call him that, right? I'm not necessarily endorsing that, but, he kind of when he was thinking of starting a third party, considered himself a moderate. And then this guy that you might have heard of, Elon Musk. Now, he wanted to start an America First Party. The America, not America First Party, the America Party. And I think most people would say he's right. So we've had an effort on the left, right? An effort that we can call sort of kind of center, and an effort on the right to start third parties. What's particularly interesting about Musk is the richest man in the world. Think about this. The richest person in the world could not create a viable third party in the United States. Think about that. And I just want to say, this is not to break my arm patting myself on the back, but as soon as he announced it, I said, that's going to fail just like all the others. It was obvious. Because although I am willing to say, and there are people who aren't, I am willing to say that while I vehemently disagree with almost everything he stands for, he's smart in a certain way. There are things, I mean, he's a smart guy. He didn't become the wealthiest man in the world without a reason for doing so. But he was unwilling to invest in learning about American politics. He didn't understand the system, and so he didn't understand the impediments to actually creating a third party. So we have 3 recent examples of not forming a viable third party, including one by the richest man, I think you could probably say this, in the history of the world. The richest man in the history of the world could not create a viable third party in the United States. So how did we get here? How did we actually end up where we are? As I said, I wrote this book not for academics. I wrote this for people like you, people who are smart, people who are educated, but people who are not professionals in terms of having a PhD in political science or being a lawyer or anything of the sort. So what I tried to do in the book was to use a sufficient number of familiar cultural references that you could relate to the things that I'm trying to convey. And one way to do that is to bring you back to your childhood, to bring you back to some childhood games with which you are familiar, one of which is rock, paper, scissors. Who doesn't know rock, paper? Everybody knows rock, paper, scissors, right? It's a pretty simple game. Scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock, rock crushes scissors. Okay, so you may have learned in middle school or high school that the framers of the Constitution thought that they were creating a rock, paper, scissors Constitution. How does it work? How does it work? So Congress sends bills to the president. The president can veto bills sent by Congress. So the president beats Congress. Everybody with me? Okay. The Supreme Court can strike down bills the president likes or executive orders as violating the Constitution. Work with me here. So the Supreme Court can beat the president can beat Congress. Okay. When you go from the playground to your math class, you probably learn something called transitivity. Works like this. 10 is greater than 5. 5 is greater than 2. Therefore, 10 is also greater than 2. Everybody see that? Transitivity. So if you apply transitivity to what I just said, the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, QED, the Supreme Court beats Congress, transitivity, except if we're talking about a statutory ruling, Congress can overrule it with an ordinary piece of legislation. If we're talking about a constitutional ruling, Congress can initiate the amending process to overturn it. So the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, but the Congress beats the Supreme Court. The reason rock, paper, scissors works is because it's an intransitive game, right? Scissors beats paper, paper beats rock, but rock beats scissors. In fact, the founders of the Constitution, the framers, got even more creative than Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, but Congress beats the Supreme Court. It would be like going to the playground and saying to these children who are playing rock, paper, scissors, let's make this more fun. How about we do this? Paper covers the scissors actually sit on top of the rock, and the rock punctures a hole through the sheet of paper, right? So we're going to call this game paper, scissors, rock. And we want you to play simultaneously rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock. What fun. Okay. And the framers basically set that up. How does this work? The president gets to veto bills sent by Congress, except Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote. So Congress beats the president. The Supreme Court does get to strike down statutes enacted by Congress on constitutional grounds. So the Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president. Applying transitivity, the Supreme Court beats the president. What is one of the greatest powers the president has? Replacing justices who retire or die. Okay, so Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president beats the Supreme Court. We have rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock. Ray, pay attention, this is especially for you because we talked about bicycle. The bookstore that Ray runs, her grandparents created a bookstore. Turns out it was originally a bike shop. And we were talking about that. Okay, but don't think of a bicycle, think of a unicycle. Why a unicycle instead of a bicycle? With a unicycle, when you pedal forward, you go forward. When you pedal backward, you go backward. With a bicycle with momentum, right, at least the kind of bicycle that we typically ride, even if you're pedaling backwards, momentum will carry you. So think of a unicycle. So you could say that what the framers of the Constitution really did was they set up a unicycle Constitution, right? Which is the same thing as a rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock Constitution. Okay, it's a lovely story, right? This is the story that gives rise to the notion of sort of benign jealousies between and among. I'm gonna give this guy a rest. He needs it. Sort of benign jealousies. The intuition the framers had was everybody would be jealous of the organ of government of which they were a part. And we would always have these never-ending rivalries between and among the relevant branches of government. And as a result, we would never have the problem that the framers most feared, which they called the danger of factions, because these rival jealousies would make sure no team always won, and we wouldn't have what they call factions and what we call parties. And it is a lovely story. We were all raised on this story. It gives rise to this concept of American exceptionalism. The framers of the Constitution solved democracy. They figured it out when nobody else had figured it out. The only problem is it's a complete myth. It never worked that way. From the beginning, our constitutional system literally never worked that way. And to explain this, come with me back to the playground, this time where toddlers and younger children are hanging out. Most of you probably remember this ride, right? If you grew up in Massachusetts, I think we called it a seesaw, but in other parts of the country, they call it the teeter-totter. It's a pretty simple ride, right? You've got a fulcrum, you've got a board, you've got two seats. One kid sits on one side, one kid sits on the other. As one child goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. Well, this became kind of a way to think about American politics. The idea being that, okay, we've got a single line like that board. On the hard left or the far left, we have an L, liberal. Far right, we have a C, conservative. And the intuition really here is that as these candidates for office try to get more and more support, what's going to happen is they are going to try to move toward the center point marked by MV, which is kind of political science geek speak for median voter, that theoretical person smack dab in the center of our politics. And as they move closer and closer to the center, those occupying the more extreme positions will continue to support them until we end up with this moderate position of the median policies that we all want. Now, it turns out that this story doesn't quite work, but what it does help us to understand is why we end up with two parties and why we end up basically making it unavailable to third parties to play a meaningful role in our politics. And how many of you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind? Yes. So this is Russell Crowe playing John Nash. John Nash won the Nobel Prize in Economics in large part for coming up with something that now bears his name, the concept of Nash equilibrium. So I'm gonna get a little bit technical here. A way to think about our two-party system is that two parties in the way we've set up the game is a pure Nash equilibrium. We have third parties, but they play a confounding role. The stable outcome is two dominant parties, largely as a result of the intuition I've just sort of established using the seesaw or teeter-totter. So one question necessarily arises. If everything I've just explained is true, why don't we see increasing moderation in our politics instead of increasing divergence in our politics? It's a fair question, right? Why is it that we're not seeing the convergence toward the median voter? Oh, by the way, the real John Nash collecting his Nobel Prize. So it wasn't always this way. In fact, for a long, I don't want to show that slide yet. Let me go back to this one. For a long time, we actually did see a kind of convergence of our major parties toward the center. And in fact, so much so that an economist by the name of Anthony Downs in the 1950s wrote this book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And the economic theory of democracy was just what I've described. Imagine we have a liberal side. Imagine we have a conservative side. Imagine the candidates want to win. They move toward the center, right? And it's, again, the lesson that many of us were raised on as children. And in fact, it was descriptive in that post-World War II period, so much so that the American Political Science Association, the largest political science association and the most influential association in the world, did a study in the early 1950s of the American two-party system. And they came up with a major critique of the two-party system. Here's what the critique was. The two parties are so similar that they do not offer American voters a meaningful choice. The problem is that the two major parties are too much alike. Now, that seems unimaginable to many of the audiences to whom I speak, and I would not ever suggest that this audience might have some more familiarity with that particular story. But nonetheless, I will say this, right? You may remember this from your parents or reading the history books. You may remember this better than some of the audiences to whom I speak. But I will say this. Think of the 1952 presidential election. In that election, the Democratic and Republican parties both tried to court the same candidate to be the top of their ticket. Dwight David Eisenhower. Imagine today, the Democratic and Republican parties chasing the same person. It's completely unimaginable, right? And if you compare the Eisenhower election, 1952, to the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon, right? They were a little bit further apart, but still pretty darn close compared, for example, to the 2000 election between Bush and Gore. And you might think, well, they were really far apart. Well, not so much as compared to the three elections involving Donald Trump, whether we're talking about the 2016 election, whether we're talking about the 2020 election, or we're talking about the 2024 election. So whether we're talking about Hillary Clinton, whether we're talking about Joe Biden, or whether we're talking about Kamala Harris, it is clear that the trend line of our politics, going back to the post-World War II period to the present, is the parties moving further and further and further apart. And in fact, this is not just an impressionistic sense. This is something that is quite demonstrable, but the question remains why. So one way to think about this is we come back to this notion of a single dimension, and we think about the fact that in our system, we have a two-staged election. We first have a primary caucus cycle, followed by the general election. Remember what I said about the median voter? Now let's apply the median voter to each of the sub-elections that represent our primaries. So now we have a median Democrat running against a median Republican, and that purchases us some distance between the two parties running in the general election. So that gives us a little bit of information, but here's what it doesn't help us understand. How is it nonetheless that we had considerable convergence that has since grown so much further and further apart? And I want to suggest this is a product of technologies that became dominant and prevalent in the information age beginning in the early to mid 1990s. So there's a really, really interesting book written by an author named David Daley. And It has the unceremonious title, Rat F. You can figure that out on your own. The true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. And he was one of the early on folks with Fair Vote, by the way. So David Daley tells the audacious plan among Republicans in the immediate aftermath of Barack Obama's 2008 election to basically flip enough state-level legislative districts by putting money on enough contests below the radar, because who cares about local politics? We all should, but none of us do, right? And of course we do at a certain level, but not nearly to the extent of the high-profile contests that draw our attention. And his intuition was, or the Republican intuition was, that if we can flip enough state legislative seats to turn purple states red and blue states maybe purple, right? What we can do is, knowing that the state legislatures apportion the district lines for the House of Representatives, we can lock in the House of Representatives as Republican for 20 years. They thought they had a lock on the House of Representatives from roughly 2010 to roughly 2030. They overshot it, flipped back in 2012, but the strategy that they used with sophisticated computer technology called red mapping was not surprisingly mirrored on the other side through blue mapping strategies. And in fact, we see this in maps like Texas red, Illinois blue. We see very sophisticated mapping strategies that have led to the consequence that although we think we are electing our representatives, we think we're choosing those who represent us in the House of Representatives. In fact, we're not choosing them. Through these gerrymandering processes, they are choosing us. And this plays out at every conceivable level. This last year, we saw this incredible contest where Texas does a mapping strategy eliciting California to do a corresponding mapping strategy, because the consequences of these strategies is not limited to the particular state. It has potential spillover effects for the entire country by controlling a particular chamber of Congress. So the second level of technology that arose in the information age has to do with the way that we receive and process news and news-like information through social media. Disclosure. This is a product called the Media Bias Chart. It's produced by a company called Ad Fontes Media, which is a public benefit corporation in Colorado. The disclosure is that the creator, Vanessa Otero, is a friend of mine. I am on the board of advisors. So just so you know, got to connect into this product. But what this really does is it maps the media landscape from left to right, which is ideology, and north to south, which is reliability. And the algorithms of social media, whether we're talking about Facebook, or which is now Meta, or we're talking about Twitter, which is now X, or we're talking about some other source like TikTok, the algorithms of social media do not reward providing thoughtful, up-the-middle, balanced stories that tell you the strengths and weaknesses of each side. Instead, what they do is they reward either extreme. They either affirm the club that you are a member of, or, somewhat counterintuitively, they provide you the opposite side so that you and your friends can denigrate the people occupying the other side as lacking basic intelligence or as evil. And so we create this dynamic feedback loop between the voting and the media and us, where the media encourages us to be further and further apart, and encourages politicians to move further and further apart, which encourage us to move further and further apart, which explains why it is that rather than continued convergence on the median voter, during the information age, as a consequence of gerrymandering and social media, we are actually becoming two distinct societies with a growing visceral distrust of those on the other side. And just as the politicians are choosing us rather than us choosing them, through these algorithms, news sources are choosing us rather than us choosing them. And that's what's fundamentally changed the landscape of our politics. And oh, by the way, if you think this is impressionistic, it's not. There's data to back it up. This is from the Pew Research Center. And what this shows is that even into the early to mid 1990s, there was considerable overlap between the Democratic and Republican parties. By the time this graphic ends in 2017, there's very little overlap. And think about this. That's 2017. Think about everything's happened between 2017 and 2026. There is almost complete sorting, right? We have virtually no one occupying that center, that center place. And one of the dangers of this is that we now have this increasing and growing fundamental distrust, but there's another layer to it. The other layer to this is that everything I've said until now assumes that we have a single liberal to conservative dimension, but in fact, we don't. Most political scientists who have studied our politics and that of other systems around the world have recognized that actually there's two dimensions. One dimension is public policy, economics, liberal to conservative. The other one is culture and identity. So you could think of economics and public policy are operating horizontally and culture and identity operating vertically. And you can imagine this as a four-frame window, which is being depicted here. And so we now have these four frames that we can fill in the boxes. And let's see if this works. So if you're conservative on public policy and culture and identity, we used to call that Republican. If you were liberal on culture and identity and public policy, we used to call that Democrat. The traditional understanding of populism is liberal on economic policy, conservative on culture and identity. And the traditional understanding of libertarian is liberal on culture and identity, but conservative on economic policy. So what happens is that if we have this two-dimensional sort of political landscape, there's actually an architectural term for the piece that separates. Imagine this is a four-frame window. There's an architectural term called a muntin, M-U-N-T-I-N. It separates the upper window panes from the lower window panes. Imagine that middle piece, the muntin in the middle there, is our seesaw. Okay, imagine it's the seesaw. And imagine that, we'll see if this works. No. Oh, come on, be nice to me. Yeah, here we go. I think it's going to be nice to me now. Imagine Donald Trump, for example, gets on one side of the muntin and he begins to ride our politics up toward conservative identity and culture. Newton's third law of motion, for every action is an equal and opposite reaction, okay, necessarily creates a corresponding on the other side move down toward kind of global, if you will, identity and culture. Here's what's so interesting about this. If you go back a generation or two, people would tell you that if they were Tea Party, the precursors to MAGA, or if they were really progressive liberals, they would tell you that the conventional two-party system disenfranchises them. There isn't a party that represents their stauncher views. Today, there's an increasing sense that MAGA has overtaken the Republican Party, and an increasing sense that the Democratic Socialists are soon to take over the Democratic Party. And today, people who are once conservative traditional Republicans or moderate traditional Democrats will tell you, I feel disenfranchised. Now, it's rare for me to be able to say what I'm about to say. All four of these groups are correct. All four of these groups, at some point in our process with only two choices on offer, are effectively disenfranchised. And this goes back to the fact that we have a two-party system that the framers of the Constitution never anticipated. Now, the centerpiece of my book is a world tour. I think it's a pretty good deal. The book's not that expensive. And I take you to 7 countries. I take you to England, France, Germany, Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Venezuela. The book's 2 years old. Some stuff's happened in a couple of those countries since then. You might have heard about it, but here's why I do it. I do this not because any of these countries are a perfect democracy. I do it because none of them are, but they allow us to get out of our heads. They allow us to get out of the stories we were told as children about American exceptionalism and to understand there are other ways to do democracy. And the central lesson of the world tour is 2 points. Number one, the real threat to democracy is extremism. And extremism manifests itself in 2 separate but complementary ways. One form of extremism is an absolute, undying commitment to an ideology and an unwillingness ever to compromise. The other one is extremism with respect to the number of parties. It turns out that a system that has too few parties, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, think Brexit, is a threat to democracy, but the flip side's also true. A system with too many parties, think Brazil, think Italy, think Spain, right? Think the Weimar Republic, okay, is equally a threat to democracy. And the central lesson of the book is to say that if we want to have a thriving multi-party democracy, the proposals that sound superficially appealing and interesting won't get us there. We have to fundamentally transform 2 aspects of our politics and our constitutional system. We have to reframe how we elect the lower legislative chamber, the House of Representatives, and how we select and hold accountable the President of the United States. I chose the countries I chose because they fill out the boxes. And it turns out that the system that was created for Germany after World War II, called mixed member proportionality, creates a vehicle, a model that's uniquely adaptable to the American system in a way that hits the sweet spot. Most political scientists would tell you that the sweet spot is to have roughly between 4 and 8 political parties, not fewer, not more. And it turns out that mixed member proportionality is the vehicle that actually allows you to hit that sweet spot. And one of the benefits of that is, imagine this. Imagine going into a voting booth and not feeling like you need a shower when you come out because of who you cast the ballot for. The way this would work is we would be casting 2 ballots for the House of Representatives rather than 1. 1 ballot for a districted seat, just like now. 2 parties would necessarily dominate that race, although it could be a different 2 parties in the Northeast than in the Southwest. But you would also cast a ballot for a particular party. And then on a state-by-state basis, you would use the party proportional ballots to determine the delegation that goes to the House. This would necessarily create a multi-party system. And then we would empower the House through coalition building to actually select the president and the vice president under a set of rules. There's a 3rd amendment that would allow the removal of a deeply problematic president, which we've never actually succeeded in. The framers got wrong the impeachment process. It has never successfully worked. One exception, the one time it wasn't used, Richard Nixon, because it would have been successfully used. But we have never formally used the impeachment process to remove the president. 25th Amendment is completely useless. We can talk about why. So the intuition here is that suddenly, when you vote for a 3rd party, rather than being punished, you would be rewarded, because 3rd party leaders would have to be able to say, I want your support as a first choice, but if I'm not going to get it, I want you to know I am willing to work with these particular parties. Not all of them necessarily, but I'll work with these parties. And in addition, they're going to have to be able to say, I'm not going to get you everything, but I'm going to tell you what the real priorities are. And I'm going to fight for those as a precondition to joining a coalition. And suddenly, You're not punished for joining those third parties. You're rewarded. You're not going to get everything. That's called politics. But you're not going to be punished. You're going to be rewarded for supporting a party that actually gives you something meaningful and of value. So I have time for one last anecdote. So this is a picture of Apollonia National Park. It's beautiful, and it's a ruin on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea between Haifa and Tel Aviv. I've gone to lots of ruins. I've had the good fortune of being able to travel enough to see some lovely spots in my in my career and in my personal life. So when I go to ruins, whether it's Angkor Wat, or whether it's Chichen Itza, or whether it's Athens or Rome or Pompeii, I usually try to situate myself in the frame of the people who live there. I try to think, what would it have been like to live in this place at this time? And when I was going on this particular tour, it was while I was doing the book, while I was writing the book, and I had a very sort of different thought. I learned that there were 5 ancient civilizations that came and went in this location: the Illyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mamelukes, and the Crusaders. And as I'm going through this, the thought that just couldn't escape focusing on was, I was convinced that every one of those ancient civilizations come and gone must have thought they were the ones that would be there forever. We humans struggle to realize how fleeting it all is. And it is fleeting. And I think it's really important that we come to grips with the fact that democracies can fail. Ours is failing. And unless we educate the public so that they actually understand what went wrong, what's required to fix it, but there's another piece of this, and it's important to me, and it's why I wrote the book: have sufficient hope to imagine it really can be fixed. It won't be. But I think it can be, but not unless we take this seriously enough. So I want to thank you all for coming out. I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have or hear any comments that you have. And thank you for spending part of your day with me here at the library. Okay. Please.
You said that you think it can be fixed. Will it be in our lifetime, do you think?
So I'm not going to ask for a birth certificate. It's funny. I get asked a version of that question almost every time I speak. And one of the things I typically say in response is, I don't know whether this will be fixed in the next election cycle. I don't know if it'll be fixed in my lifetime. But I do think it can be fixed. And what's required for it to be fixed is for us to unlearn what we've been told our whole lives about American exceptionalism, to imagine that it's possible to learn from the lessons of other historical democracies around the globe, some that have successfully overcome existential challenges to their continued existence as democracies, and some that have succumbed to the threat, right? I don't have an answer to, I have no crystal ball. I'm a law professor, not a seer. I don't know, I can identify multiple things that have occurred over the last 10 years that I would have thought, if ever there was a tipping point, this was the moment, that have not been. But I do think that part of the problem here is that out in the ether, there are proposals like ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, get rid of the Electoral College and replace it with the national popular vote, put term limits on members of the Supreme Court, and this is going to solve everything. I will tell you, these things will solve nothing. I can talk about these things individually. I talk about them a lot in the book, why they won't work. And I think that we really need to focus America's attention on the fact that there are 2 axes that need serious repair. and that the framers got it wrong. And one of the things I didn't say in my formal comments, but I'll say this. They got it wrong from the beginning. If you read or if you read or listen to, if you have the capacity, not that it was originally recorded, but you can get an audio version of George Washington's farewell address after his second term. You realize that George Washington's basically saying that whole rock, paper, scissors thing isn't working out. We have a two-party system and it's causing lots of damage. Now that's not the language he used. It requires some translation to take the language he used and get it there. That's what he's saying. He's basically saying that the mythology, this set of ideas about competition among the branches being the thing that will solve our democracy, right? That other countries hadn't figured out, but the framers brilliantly did, just turns out not to be the game that's being played. Already we had partisan politics. I have a couple of ideas about a pathway that could conceivably result in something like what I'm proposing. But I have no capacity to say the moment at which that inflection point in our culture and politics will occur. I just don't have that capacity to do that. And I'll be honest, like, you know, one of the things about my proposal that's different from every other proposal, I talked about the non-political viability of other proposals. Mine is the only proposal that leaves every sitting member of the House and Senate an incumbent in their existing district or state. Mine is the only proposal that doesn't threaten their status. All of the other ones are designed specifically to replace them with somebody else. And we've never had an amendment to the Constitution that has arisen through a convention as opposed to through Congress. There's two ways to do it. We've always gone through Congress. And it's impossible, to my thinking, to say to members of Congress, we would like you to support an amendment that translates to your unemployment. Right? There's kind of a riff on the saying that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is power corrupts, the threat of the loss of power corrupts absolutely. And so the idea that term limits or multi-member districts is designed to change the mix, right, of who gets elected as compared to who is elected now. The idea that you're going to get the kind of support needed behind that, I think is a delusion and a misunderstanding. Whereas my proposal doubles the House. The districts remain exactly as they are, but we have a second cohort that are elected through proportional representation. One of the real benefits of proportional representation is that one of the real threats to democracy is gerrymandering, right? So proportional representation eliminates the incentive to gerrymander. All of the gains that you would get from drawing district lines favorably to a party get eliminated by the all of the gerrymandered gains get eliminated by the proportionality principle. So basically you're saying to members of the House, you get to keep all the gains you've already got. Don't try to play future games because you're not going to win. You can't gerrymander the Senate because the lines are drawn. Right? So we don't have to worry about it with the Senate. Please.
So what can we do to make it eventually change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You know, it's a funny thing. There's a book by Malcolm Gladwell called, there's a trilogy of books. He's written more since then. One called The Tipping Point, one called Outliers, getting the name of the third one. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But one of the main themes of Gladwell's writings is that there are different kinds of strengths that different people have. There are people who come up with ideas, he calls them mavens. There are people who are connectors. Wendy's a connector. I don't mean to suggest she's not a maven, but she's a connector. Anybody who knows Wendy knows she's a connector, right? And there are salesmen. That's the other category, right? Which is sexist for salesperson. So, you know, one of the problems I think in our culture is the expectation that everybody's all three of these things. It's just not true, right? I mean, I'm a law professor. I'm not running for office. I don't plan to run for office. I wouldn't be particularly good at running for office, right? And I wouldn't enjoy holding one. So it's just not going to happen, right? I wrote the book because I thought that there was something profoundly missing in our discourse, that there wasn't a clear explanation that ordinary folks who were well-educated could rely upon to figure out what went wrong and to understand a pathway forward. I get emails every week from people who ask me that question. What can I do? And, what I tell them is, look, I'll come talk to audiences. If somebody wants to become a political activist and make this their life's work, I'll help in any way that I can, but I'm not going to be that person because it's not what I do for a living. I like what I do for a living. I'm a law professor. I teach law. I teach constitutional law and economic analysis of law. I think I'm pretty good at it. I don't think I'd be as good at these other jobs. So, my goal, and I've been doing this now for 2.5 years. Book launches basically start a few months before the book actually gets published and go until about 6 months after. I've given lots and lots of talks across the country. I've been on podcasts, some pretty high profile, some more obscure. I will keep talking to people and hope that I connect with people who are themselves connectors or salespeople who will figure out how to make this a political reality. And I'll continue to engage with people who I think get it wrong, which doesn't always make it popular, right? When you engage with people who are committed, for example, to ranked choice voting, and I can explain to you why that's a complete misleading idea for fixing our democracy. I've given talks and found out that after saying things unkind about ranked choice, truthful but unkind about ranked choice voting, that I've got somebody who's dedicated their lives to ranked choice voting. And I've explained why they're wrong. And that doesn't always beat with, oh, thank you for explaining why my dedication is wrong. But this is what I do. And again, why I wouldn't be a particularly good politician, because I'm willing to tell people who are wrong that they're wrong. So I haven't got the clean answer that you're looking for. But I do think this. I do think ideas matter. I think ideas matter. I think that no political movement has ever started devoid of an inspiring idea, right? I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. And I know that although I don't always agree with Malcolm Gladwell because he tends to under-theorize when he writes, he's right about that. That we need the synergies of different skill sets to ever do anything. So I hope that's somewhat responsive. Please.
Now you wrote this before Trump was elected.
I did.
Right? So do you?
And I'm proud of that, by the way.
And I think what you said makes a lot of sense. Do you think what we're facing now under Trump has set that back even more? Just a couple examples. The whole thing on voting, for example, he has cast such a thing now that there's suspicion that in our voting, which never, I think, existed before, that everyone is suspicious now that the voting is all rigged. The media, the sense we don't, it's not Walter Cronkite, we listen to the media. We can't believe the media anymore.
Right.
Education, he's into education of what can be taught. They're changing a lot of things within the system. And just civility, just being civil. There's this hatred and name calling. Has this current president set your goals way back?
So that's another question I often get too, and it's a great question. These are all great questions. Possibly it could have a counterintuitive effect. So one of the things that's quite interesting, we've never had a constitutional convention, which is an alternative pathway to amending the Constitution. People think we've had a constitutional convention because we had the convention under the Articles that actually got us the Constitution. We never had a convention under the Constitution, right? As opposed to the convention that was tasked with fixing the Articles and instead created the Constitution. So we've come close, though, to a call for a convention twice. In the 60s and 80s, I don't remember which is which, but one period in the 60s we were within a single vote, a single state. Once we were within 2 states. That's pretty close. And I've actually tried to tally it. I've tried to tally how close we are, and there's different ways of counting it. It's complicated because some states have called for a convention for a specific purpose, but it's not clear whether you can limit a convention to a specific purpose. So it's not simple arithmetic. But here's what I could imagine happening. I can imagine the Democratic Socialists taking over the Democratic Party the way MAGA took over the Republican Party in 2016, disenfranchising centrist Democrats and actually winning, because it's not obvious who the heir apparent is to Donald Trump in the Republican Party. This noise about him running for a third term, you'd actually have to amend the Constitution for him to do that. Because, like the Constitution prohibits it since FDR. I mean, assuming that we care about those things, but those details. So you could imagine an election producing an extreme opposite result that would make the Republicans as angry as Democrats generally are now. And you could potentially imagine that producing an alliance, at least for the limited purpose of this is broken, let's figure out what the hell to do. And then imagine that we actually got past the threshold and we ended up with a constitutional convention. My intuition is that the convention would throw out all the things that don't work, right? Here's a list of things. And of course, they would claim that they would work. Let's have ranked choice voting, let's have multi-member districts, let's put term limits, right? And then Congress is sitting there saying, okay, what do we do? Well, here's what they could do. Some of the folks could read my book, and then they could say, hey, wait a minute. This is other idea. That actually lets us keep our jobs. And actually, unlike these things that are being proposed, would fix the crisis we're in by creating a multi-party constitutional democracy. And here's what's interesting about this. We all hate Congress. I get it. I don't care. Let them be the heroes of American democracy, the very people that we dislike. I don't care who takes credit for these ideas, right? Let Congress become the heroes that actually fix American democracy. Let it happen after I'm dead. I don't care when it happens, right? I mean, I'd like it to be sooner than later because it's miserable. But, my point is, it's possible that the very worsening creates a pathway toward bettering. It's also possible that people just do hit an inflection point based on an event that I can't foresee because I can give you a dozen things that I would have thought good enough. I'm insufficiently creative to come up with something between that and the trigger. I don't know. I'm like, the people who wrote the Federalists, they wrote fiction, right? I'm a nonfiction writer. The Constitution never worked the way, Hamilton J. Madison envisioned in the Federalist Papers. I always tell my students that belongs in the fiction, not history section of the library. But I write nonfiction, so I'm not able to come up with that creative thing. But I do think it's possible either that we hit an inflection point and Congress takes it seriously because the American public takes it seriously, or that it just goes in the opposite direction and that becomes a trigger, right? I will also say this about our cultural divides and distrust. I'm not Pollyannish, I'm not naive, but I really do believe that if we were a thriving multi-party democracy, the algorithm that's motivating the media sources to go further and further apart and our feeds to be dominated with these stories would look different. If we actually had multiple parties negotiating coalition governance, there would be more anchors than two, and you could actually find profitable providing people what they actually want, which we don't have now. And that's the danger. Others, please.
Right, well, I hear what you're saying, but I just don't think that change that you're discussing is going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, you're a skeptic, and I respect skeptics. Yeah.
And if you met my people, like my friends and my people, you would call them my slimmers. Okay.
Yeah.
Even within my group of my friends, we have discussed possibly things have gone just a little too far on the woke side.
Yeah.
Okay. And that possibly we need to rein things back a little bit because we kind of need to reach across the aisle
Right.
and grab those people that consider themselves Republican but really don't like Donald Trump.
Right.
So for me,
Yeah.
I honestly believe that the next election kind of has to be a very moderate, charismatic white male. I mean, and this is what we discussed, some of it is just gone, yeah, because what we're fighting for is
Yeah.
democracy. We're not even fighting for one individual group of
Yeah.
one thing. We're fighting for our country. And we really need to have.
Vanilla.
We do,
So-
but and I'm
Yeah.
so sorry to say that, because as a female who has fought so hard for so many things.
Right.
But it's just sort of waking up and realizing what you need to do to get everybody, at least, let's start. I mean, I have a friend who's a nurse at Boston Medical, and she is being told that she cannot say breastfeeding. She has to call it chest feeding because it can be, it triggers people who are trans. This is gone. She's a professional. She can't even use that anatomy. Some of it really has just gone totally too far.
So let me, if I may respond, yeah. So, let me just say, I am fully aware of stories like the one that you mentioned about breastfeeding versus chest feeding. And not only because my wife happens to be a medical oncologist who's a specialist of breast cancer, but that happens to be true. But because I'm a law professor, and I'm surrounded by people who hold very committed views in the direction you're discussing. So let me try to disentangle a premise of what you've said, because I think it's really vital. What you suggested is that you think that this is implausible and also, I heard you, I promise. And that what we need to do is come up with a candidate who, within the Democratic Party, looks like a traditional president, right? That's what you're saying. Here's the problem. You are ascribing to the party a view of an individual. I know lots of people who think the way you've just described. I really do. I know a lot of people who hold more staunchly progressive views, but who have said, forget it, what we really need to do is get somebody who looks like, let's look at the list of presidents, right? We had something unusual a couple of presidents ago, but let's just be realistic about this. That's not happening in 2028. We need somebody who looks like the other presidents. Okay. I've heard lots of people say that. Here's the problem. You can't make people within the Democratic Party who say enough is enough is enough. This is the time to actually thwart that norm and have a person of color or have a person who is a woman, right, occupy that office. And I am unwilling to support you. I will vote for the Green Party. I will vote for any third party. And then that group has the Democratic Party over a barrel, precisely the same way that MAGA originally had the Republicans over a barrel. And one of the things I'm trying to get across in this book is we need to understand how institutions work. Understanding how institutions work means understanding the difference between the way individual human beings think and how the institutions that bring them together and actually process what they think into outputs actually operates differently. And unless we're willing to come to grips with the fact that a small minority of the Democratic Party, if they defect, means Republicans win. The Republicans learned that lesson. Republicans are highly disciplined. Republicans never lose sight of one simple fact. Politics is about power. Democrats, on the other hand, form circular firing squads again and again because they think politics is about principle. Their principle. Not the other people in the firing squad. Their principle. And so you're right. If you could get all you have to do is lobotomize everybody to agree with you.
Yeah.
The problem is you don't have that ability. And as a result, there's a structural impediment to implementing your solution, which gets me back to my earlier. I'm not going to tell you when this is going to happen. I'm not going to tell you what the trigger is, but I am going to tell you this. This is the solution. And those simpler ideas like behave better, which is your argument, what you're basically saying is people just need to behave more responsibly. Admonishing people to behave like adults doesn't make institutions behave as if it's an aggregation of adults. You can't just tell people to be better and imagine you get better results in politics. Because everybody thinks they're telling everybody to be better, and we ended up where we are. My point in writing this book is no, we have to be serious. Telling people to behave like adults isn't, I don't mean to suggest it's not individually serious. Have those conversations with your friends. What I am telling you is, it's not a nationally serious solution to a structural problem. Unless we understand that the institutions are broken, they never work the way they were supposed to work, there are identifiable causes for why they have gone off the rails, despite the fact that we've put up with them for a very long time. Unless we come to fundamental grips with the deficiencies of our institutions, we will not fix this. And the only way that you can create a cross-party coalition is to create incentives that reward a cross-party coalition. Our institutions punish that rather than reward it. And we have seen it again and again and again and again and again. And unless we are serious about this and understand, well, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is my not telling people to be better? They're better self-sufficient. We aren't going to solve this problem. Please.
First, thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'll buy the book. I don't know if I'll really read it, but I will buy it.
Well, let me also say,
No, I'm not saying.
it's also available as an audiobook if that helps.
No, so I have actually a couple of things that I'm interested in your thoughts on.
Yeah.
One is, so I'm, a die-hard Democrat all my life and happy when the world fell apart in America that I lived in Massachusetts, and now
I'm old enough to remember, don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts.
Right, so, but now my thinking has evolved, because as I look at what's happened over the last 15 years, I say to myself, I never really felt like I had a choice I loved when I went to vote for president, but I always felt comfortable that if my guy or girl didn't win, that in 4 years I had another chance, and that nobody could really screw it up this bad. But now that it's as screwed up as it seems to be, I'm sort of scratching my head saying, how did I miss the boat? What happened that I wasn't paying attention to? And I think about, Newt Gingrich and his coalition back in the 80s or 90s when Clinton was in office, and how just quietly we slept while they did all their hard work in the background for the Christian coalition.
Yep.
And what I didn't hear addressed at all in your speech, which I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts upon and I'm interested in, is, our history began by not wanting religion and politics mixing together, and now they are. And I don't know what path that's going on. And the second question I'm interested in your thoughts on is, it feels to me like, Project 2025 and Heritage Foundation had a well-drawn map on what their puppet was going to put in place. And that the Democrats, if they had something in their back pocket because they were doing a lot of work in preparation, they haven't shown it to you yet. Could you address those?
Sure.
concerns?
So there's sort of two parts of your question, one having to do specifically with religion and politics, and the other one having to do with Project 2025, for which there's presently an emerging counterpart that I think is frankly fundamentally misguided project. I don't mean to say the content's misguided. I think allowing the other side to define your project is misguided, and it's called Project 2029. I just don't think it's good to say to the other side, please tell us what our playbook should be titled. I think that's generally unwise. And I would say that in both directions. What I'm saying is bipartisan there. I would say the same thing if the shoe were on the other foot. Let me say this. I don't. This is not a constitutional law class. The history on the relationship between religion and government is more complicated than many of us think it is. Think about the fact that the First Amendment is an amendment. The original Constitution allowed states to have established religions. And frankly, the First Amendment really isn't about states. It's really about the federal government. Right, when we're talking about free exercise and establishment clause, it's only much later in our history when we have a doctrine called incorporation, where we take the Bill of Rights and apply it to the states. So the understanding that the Constitution was always about separating these two things, you can find support in some of the writings of Thomas Jefferson, of course, for obvious reasons. And I'm not here to give a constitutional history lesson, but I am here just to say it's a little more complicated. Right. Like if we're really going to get into that question, I would assign you some readings and would have a conversation like a book club, because it's just much more complicated. The second question goes back to my earlier answer, which is, yeah, the Republican contract with America, to which you were referring to with Newt Gingrich, is an instantiation of the idea that never gets lost on Republicans, that politics is about power. And Democrats always think politics is about principle. And one of the things I talk about in my book is why Democrats have a structural disadvantage as compared to Republicans to coordinate behavior in ways that further an agenda. And it's true, and it actually ends up also being true for very specific reasons with respect to gerrymandering. There are very specific reasons why Republicans, despite the fact that we have blue mapping responses to red mapping, there are very specific reasons having to do with the history of race, which undergirds literally everything in the United States history, that help to explain why Republicans can red map more effectively than Democrats can blue map. That just happens to be true. I can explain why that's the case if you would like, but the reality is that it is easier for Republicans to coordinate behavior for very specific reasons having to do with the difference between what these parties are about. They're different kinds of clubs in a very significant sense. And I've spent lots of time hanging out with people in both clubs. I'm an unusual law professor. The first 13 years of my career, I was teaching at George Mason Law School, which if you've never heard of it, is really, there was a recent article just this week saying that it is the go-to law school for Trump appointees to the federal bench. It's really developed a reputation. It's now called the George Mason Antonin and Scalia School, well, law school, whatever. Right, and I began my career teaching at George Mason Law School and sort of a conservative libertarian place. I explain this in the book. And since over the last 20 years, I've been teaching at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, which is a liberal progressive law school. And I can kind of tell you that when I was at George Mason Law School, I was kind of the resident commie, and in Maryland, I'm the resident opposite of commie, and I haven't changed. I'm basically the same person that I was then, right? So, I mean, so like I'm familiar with people who are libertarians and social conservatives, and I'm familiar with people who are centrist Democrats and democratic socialists. Like I've really, unlike lots of people, hung out with groups in all of all of these different ways of thinking. And, and really, I think this is thematic of several of the questions. We have seen the emergence of a bimodal voting distribution in this country. The intuition that we all have, the intuition that feeds support for ranked choice voting and multi-member districts, is that our voting distribution is what a statistician would call a Gaussian distribution, a standard bell curve, where conservatives and liberals occupy opposite ends, but they're willing to take slightly less conservative or liberal and moderate to the opposite side. But the problem is that that's not our voting distribution. Our voting distribution is increasingly bimodal. It's like picture not a dromedary, but an actual two-hump camel, right? We have a two-hump camel electorate, and the humps are moving further and further apart. That's what's going on. And there isn't really much space left in our politics for that centrist position, right? That is just the valley between these two humps. And the question then becomes, how do we make it so that we create a basis for what we used to call moderate Republicans and we used to call centrist Democrats, that they can actually come together to help the country instead of supporting the increasingly extreme views who are unwilling to acknowledge that women have breasts, for example, right? How do we do that, right? And my argument is we have to recognize that the inability to do that is structural. It's structural. It's something embedded in our institutions that requires a serious fix, that requires us to grapple with the original misunderstandings the framers had that have given rise in the last 30 plus years to a profound dysfunction that has invited this crisis.
So one last question,
Sure.
Renee.
I think that that's the bell that we've got 5 minutes left. I'm gonna assume that. I'm gonna call it a 5-minute bell.
If you were gonna tell me who the top 3 or 4 groups were that are working on some substantive change to us, Who would you say they are?
I'm sorry,
You've thrown out this ideas
yeah,
of how to change our system so it can work
Yeah.
better as representative for all. Are there other people working on this? There must be. It's a big, beautiful country, and who has
look, I've
in their
I've
proposal?
had conversations with people who have talked about starting organizations to do this.
Yeah,
The book's out 2 years, which I know sounds like a lot of time,
no, it's not.
but it's nothing.
Yeah.
It's nothing. You know, and I've given talks, dozens and dozens of talks to all different kinds of audiences, it's a nanosecond in the scheme of things.
But you've
So
got this one idea out there. There must be other people that have ideas.
they do, and one of the reasons I wrote this book was to explain why those other ideas don't work. And I want to be clear, let me just be clear about this, because I know how arrogant that sounds. I don't mean that to sound arrogant. I happen to have a toolkit that most people writing in this space don't have. In order to really understand this, you need to really understand economic theory, in particular sub-branches of economic theory called social choice and game theory. And I happen to have been working in that integration with constitutional law for 25 years before I began this project. So it's not that I'm the brightest person in a room ever. It's that I happen to just have a combination of skills and understandings that people who write in this space don't have. And I can tell you, there's a blog called Balkanization, created by a Yale law professor, Jack Balkan. You can look it up on the internet. And we did a symposium recently about my book, where I had 6 law professors writing critiques of my book. They're really smart people. I mean, super smart people, right? Among the most well-known constitutional law people in the country. Including one who teaches at the University of Texas, one who's the dean at the University of California at Berkeley. It's not a question of intelligence; it's a question of skill set, right? And so, I that's why I wrote the book, because I had something important to say, and I'll just keep saying it. Anyway, we're nearing the end.
Just a quick thing, I was gonna say, I think because of the greed that's at the top and the billionaires that are controlling, we've got everything, media, funding for the election.
Yeah.
I don't think that can change.
Well, so let me close with this one thought. One criticism I get, including in that symposium, is that I didn't spend a lot of time talking about Citizens United, which is a case that allows corporations to spend a lot of money on politics. And it's not because, oh, gee, it didn't occur to me. It's because of this. Money is like water getting to its lowest point. In politics, money always finds a way in. The question is, can you create institutions where money does less damage by creating more focal points than 2? The reason I didn't spend a lot of time in Citizens United is because overturning Citizens United will not solve the problem. Changing the institutions so that money aren't pushing the wings further and further apart will. And so I don't disagree. Yes, money, you can't make money disappear from politics, but here's what you can. You can make our institutions more resilient against expenditures. Remember what I said in my talk. Even the wealthiest man in the world could not create a third party. Money and politics are not the same thing. You need to understand institutions to understand the damage or the benefit money can provide to politics. I think I'll stop it.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you.